Tonight, on Closer Look, some controversy over Sunshine Girls. The Toronto Sun's long-running photo series is still a daily feature, but the newspaper hasn't actually photographed anyone new since COVID. Instead, the paper has taken to rerunning old shots and aggressively sharing them online for extra clicks. TorontoToday reporter Alex Flood did a little digging and discovered that some women aren't thrilled that their old photos are being reused again and again. Alex joins us tonight from downtown Toronto to talk about his story. Alex, while writing this piece, you spoke to a number of former Sunshine Girls and critics of the feature that has been a part of the Toronto Sun's identity for over 50 years. Does its continued presence, albeit in a zombie form, reflect nostalgia, or is it a failure to adapt to changing societal values?
For sure. And it's an ongoing debate, Scott. I mean, and you mentioned there over 50 years of history in the city. So I think just the name itself, when somebody hears Toronto Sunshine Girl, that sparks a memory or that sparks nostalgia for so many. You ask most anybody on the street who's perhaps 40 or above, they probably know somebody that was once a Sunshine Girl back in the 80s and the 90s because they had a new woman essentially every day featured in their paper. So many people in Ontario have been a part of this. And so many would argue that, yes, that this is an institution. But however, with what we've been seeing online in recent days and the repetition with the photos, many people are starting to question the legitimacy of the so-called institution now. And when you're looking at that kind of repetition and you're hearing the outcry from some of these women, it goes even further and deeper than that. So when you have a very dedicated Toronto Sun audience and a very dedicated audience to the Sunshine Girls complaining, then I think, you might be in a bit of trouble because that's what we are seeing right now.
Yeah, for sure. Now, several former Sunshine Girls mentioned they were under the impression their photos would only be used once. Has there been any insight into whether this practice raises legal or ethical concerns around consent and image rights?
Perhaps just the ethics side of it. When it comes to a legal standpoint, I mean, these women did sign a waiver before they got their photos taken that, the Toronto Sun essentially has ownership of these photos. So there's really nothing from a legal standpoint that I've done or that I've seen through any research that they would be able to argue it in a legal aspect. But when it comes to ethics, for sure, I think some people will argue that this might go against it. Although some people will say, well, too bad. You signed off your rights essentially for photos. So it is what it is. But from the women's perspective, some of them are, of course, upset that they're getting rerun again because they never thought when they were signing that waiver that, oh, yeah, the photo I took in 2013 or 2014 is going to be in the paper 10 years later. That's not a thought that's running through some of these women's heads when they're doing this when they're 21, 22. Now they're in their low 30s. So ethics concerns for sure. Legal concerns, probably not as much.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit, Alex. Your story focuses largely on how these former models feel their outdated photos misrepresent who they are today. Did any of the women that you interviewed share stories of how this exposure has impacted their personal or professional lives?
Absolutely, Scott. On both counts, I would say. When it comes to professionally, we've spoken to women like Sephra, who was mentioned in the story, who's a real estate agent now in Windsor. So, she would just rather not have these photos being rerun again and again. And I think when you are in the public eye, there's an understanding that people could go dig up stuff on you for sure. And maybe they'll find a photo Sephra from 2018 or 2019 when she had her photo shoots done. But, for it to be rerun again and again today, she's not a big fan of that. And she didn't realize that it was what she was signing up to do. And then on the personal side, of course, her family, friends, sometimes she'll get a text message saying, oh, I didn't know you were a Sunshine Girl, or, oh, I didn't know that you were getting featured again today. And Sephra, in her case, is kind of like shoulders up, thinking I didn't know either. So, she's been rerun several times and she's kind of just been left shaking her head because she feels like she didn't consent to them doing this several times over and over. But she understands she consented to doing it in 2019.
Now, Alex, other outlets like the Winnipeg Sun, for example, have phased out similar features due to evolving audience expectations. Why do you think the Toronto Sun persists with this practice despite facing criticism and diminishing returns?
That's the big question we had for the Toronto Sun. We sent them quite a few questions. We didn't hear back from them. But yeah, it's a question that we're really wanting answers to as well, I think. And I think a lot of the public wants answers to that after reading our coverage, because I think what it comes down to is just is this out of date now? Has this been maybe perhaps overkilled? And I think when we look at the Winnipeg Sun, who was bought by a different company than the one that bought Toronto Sun, which is Post Media, they realized it rather quickly. And in fact, the Winnipeg Sun even said that we're rerunning photos. We don't think this is an acceptable practice anymore. Let's replace it where we're highlighting volunteers and cool people in our community. I don't know why the Toronto Sun hasn't done that yet. Maybe they've considered it. Maybe they're talking about it or have been for some time, but we just don't know at the moment. My theory, and I think a lot of people's theories, if we can theorize, is that they do just want to hold on to something that's been a long-standing institution in Toronto. Other Suns in the country have had the Sunshine Girls for a while, but honestly, the Toronto Suns, I think, stands alone when it comes to exposure and when it comes to its name. So I can see why they would maybe want to keep holding on to this, even though they don't have a photo studio. But I think some people are now questioning, has this gone on for too long?
Now, the Sun claims these reruns are by popular demand, yet reader complaints, Alex, would suggest otherwise. There's an obvious disconnect here between what the paper thinks its audience wants and what reality is. Is that fair to say?
I think to an extent it is. And as I mentioned before, its loyal audience and its loyal followers of the Sunshine Girls specifically, when you go to videos or the photo galleries, that a lot of the comments are their own followers saying, I've already seen this Sunshine Girl 10 times, or like, this is just recycled at this point. So I think when you're looking at it just from their audience and not even picking apart the general public's audience, but their audience specifically, that they just don't know what is really going on anymore at this point. And the Sun hasn't been very vocal about it either. They have been vocal in the newspaper and how they're advertising themselves, in the sense that, they publicly accept that they're rerunning these. They're not hiding away from that. But I think, that they are just really trying to hold on to this, and maybe the hopes of opening up a photo studio soon. Again, we don't really know at the moment, but their audience clearly isn't incredibly thrilled at the moment.
All right, finally, Alex, what sort of reaction has your story received? What kind of feedback are you getting?
It's been a mix. I spoke to a couple Sunshine Girls former who are very happy with the series still. They would be happy having their photos reran. So despite the criticism it's faced from some of the women, there's a balance to this, that I'm sure there are many previous women who wouldn't mind having their photos rerun. Although a lot of those women I did speak with are older, so they're into their late 40s, 50s. One of them I spoke to is even in their early 60s. So I think there's some discussion to be had about, well, yeah, it's been a long time. Perhaps you're retired, or perhaps this was so long ago it wouldn't impact your career now. Maybe you're approaching the end of your career life. So I think some would argue that that's a bit different than someone who's actively in public life and actively trying to build a name for themselves, that's getting their photos reran 10 times. So I've heard a mix of that. I've heard people who are supportive of it. They don't mind it. Some people don't have a lot of empathy for these women because they did sign their rights away, and it just is what it is. Whatever you post online could stay there forever. It's rule number one, and everybody knows that. But again, on the other side, reaction from people who feel bad, wish these women didn't have to have their photos reran without at least getting a heads up from the Toronto Sun. And I guess we'll see where it goes from here. But we've heard from people wanting them to do something like what the Winnipeg Sun is doing now, where you kind of move away from the super tabloidy Sunshine Girls feature of days gone by. That this is just too old to run past its course, and find something that's more modern and with the times now. Will the Sun do it? Not sure, but we poked them with some questions, so hopefully maybe we'll see something soon.
There's Toronto Today reporter Alex Flood on the reruns of The Sunshine Girl in the Toronto Sun. That's all for a closer look this Wednesday. We'll be back tomorrow night at 7 with another episode. For all of us at Village Media, thanks for watching.